in the early part of June when NATO was having its summit meeting there. I was asked to come over and speak at one of the counter summit meetings that were taking place to counter the narrative of NATO and to participate in the demonstration that took place there. So NATO met in Spain, and they had decided to expand the scope of NATO so it can be used all around the world. They added some NATO partners in Europe because one of their goals, they said, was to target China as well as targeting Russia. And this has really stepped up in my opinion, the aggression of NATO. So many people saw that, and many people came to Madrid, and the Spanish movement mobilized, and we had some very large demonstration in Spain. Thousands of people demonstrated against NATO, and there were two counter summits that took place. I spoke at one of them. The two counter summits actually kind of represented the divide that's taking place among anti-war activists and others over the Ukraine situation. Both of them came out with strong statements against NATO, but one of them did not mention Ukraine at all. And the other one, which I was at, which I spoke at, and gave a strong statement against the U.S. NATO role in Ukraine, did very much agree with my position and put out a statement saying as much.
So, Joe, why do you think the people in this country, I mean, the blackout is pretty terrible, but in Europe, how did the Europeans feel about the United States today and what they're doing in Ukraine?
Well, you got to distinguish between the governments and the people. I think there's not a lot of love among the European people for the United States and what it's doing now and what it has done in the past. Um, when you talk about the media blackout, one of the things I was very surprised about was the amount of coverage that our actions had in Spain. Every news station and every newspaper covered it prominently. One newspaper in Madrid did its whole front page on the demonstrations with a huge picture of the demonstrations. Afterwards, I was up in some other places, including Berlin, where we had another demonstration against NATO. So I think there's a difference in the way people feel about it and the way the governments are going along with what the United States is doing in Ukraine and has been doing in Afghanistan and Iraq and many other places. And they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot by going along with these sanctions, because the sanctions are clearly hurting the the European governments and European countries much more, and the United States much more than it is Russia. And I think we're going to see a real turn in terms of the population in these countries as more and more they start feeling the sting of these sanctions that we've imposed on Russia.
So, Scott, you've been more or less blacklisted again. Um, what do you think ultimately um, that will achieve? I
But
mean,
blacklisting me,
yeah.
not a damn thing. Um,
Okay.
I mean, the pathetic actions on the part of those who seek to manipulate data to deceive are just that pathetic. I mean, history will judge them accordingly. There's censoring me, censoring other people, well, Joe, yourself, anybody who is out there attempting to, you know, speak truth, have a fact-based discussion, um, can't change the reality on the ground. You can censor me all you want. That ain't going to raise your thermostat by any amount come winter. You're still going to freeze. Um,
Uh-huh.
Censor Joe all you want. That ain't going to change the outcome on the battlefield in Europe. The Ukrainian army is still getting crushed on a daily basis. Um, Sanction you, Cynthia. Let's silence Cynthia. Wow. That still doesn't change the fact that NATO is a pathetic organization who probably saw its high water mark in June. Um, I mean, the performance of Stoltenberg and company in Madrid, I mean, pointing at maps, putting up PowerPoints, talking about 300,000 troops. It was a performance that reminded me of that, the scene of Hitler in the bunker in the last days of the Battle of Berlin, where he's at a map, arrows, he's moving armies with his hands, and he's this, that. It ain't reality based. NATO is a paper tiger. NATO has no military depth. NATO has no military capacity. NATO is pathetic. NATO is linked to Europe. Europe's economy is collapsing. This is the reality. Censor me all you want. You're not going to change that reality one iota.
So how much are we spending to prop up NATO?
Billions. I mean, look, it's more than just money. NATO cannot exist without the United States. End of story, full stop. Bang.
Mm-hmm.
You can take any other country out of NATO. Take 2 or 3 out of NATO. NATO can still exist as long as the United States is there. Remove the United States from the equation, NATO collapses like the house of cards that it is. So it's not just a matter of money. It's the matter of the politics of it. Without the United States, there is no NATO. NATO is a proxy arm of the military and national security policy of the United States. It is an extension of that. It exists solely to promote American power. It doesn't promote European power. There is no such thing as European power. Europe has no power. Good luck, Europe. Try to be a power. You can't. You need the United States to make you relevant. It used to be a time when Europe was relevant. Not anymore. It's sold its soul to the devil, and the devil's got nothing.
Joe, would you agree?
Yeah, yes, totally. I do agree. I believe U.S. leads NATO. NATO is an extension and an arm of U.S. imperialism. And that's the way it's always been used. I mean, why was NATO in Afghanistan? What does that have to do with the North Atlantic? It has nothing to do with the North Atlantic. Why did they ask Colombia to be a partner? Or why did they ask South Korea and Japan to be partners of them when it's a North Atlantic Treaty Organization? It's just an extension of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. imperialism. And it has never been a defensive organization. It's an aggressive organization. The world will be much better without NATO.
Do the Europeans realize that? Have they been voicing their opinion to that effect?
Well, not the European countries that have been going along with it, but there has been some divisions. There's been some divisions in the EU, and there's been some divisions in NATO. For instance, in the EU, not every country has now said they're going to go along with this 15% cut. In the gas usage that's going to go on. There's been some differences on how how NATO should support the war in Ukraine, and there's been discussions that have gone on between France and Germany, for instance, and Russia that have been different than the discussions than the narrative of the United States. So I think there will be real problems, and I think the fact that Johnson in Britain and Draghi in Italy have lost their positions is an indication of the discontent. A lot of people see it in terms of the economic problems that they're having, but that's caused by the Russian sanctions and the war in Ukraine to a large part. There's other problems with capitalism in general, but the neoliberalism that is practiced by the main capitalist countries in particular. But it is primarily this. And it's pretty clear that although the coalition that might come into Italy after Draghi leaves might be a right-wing coalition, they also have a different position on NATO and the war in Ukraine. Those are the parties that will likely make up that coalition. And what does that mean if Italy, the third biggest economy in the EU, leaves that fight? It opens the door for all different options. So I think the United States and NATO and the EU are in very bad position right now.
And NATO is still on the border of Russia, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that hasn't changed at all.
No. Well, when they're going into Finland and they're going into Sweden, and they'd love to still go into Ukraine, but that's not going to happen anymore. That's very, very clear. So, but there are other countries that are very close by. There are countries we promised never to go into, and we're in 14 of those now with NATO. And we've conducted military maneuvers right on their border. We have nuclear capable missiles very close to their border. But Ukraine was a line they said is a red line, and that it will not let NATO pass, and that NATO tried to pass it anyway.
I think you could best answer this question, Scott. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the USSR was no longer in existence, then the whole ideology changed, but our outlook towards Russia is still the same. Why? Why is that?
Well, there's a couple reasons. First and foremost, we've never been friends with Russia. So we've always been, if not enemies, we've been in opposition. Even in the final years of the Soviet Union, where relations started to warm up, we might have had friendly relations superficially, but when you dig into the policy, every policy was guarded. Every position paper that was written in support of a given policy, always maintained an element of distrust towards the Soviet Union in its final, moments, and then Russia emerging. And then with Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were treating Russia as a defeated enemy, not as a friend in need. And what we did to Russia in the decade of the 1990s is a crime beyond comprehension. Americans have no clue what we did. We sit here and cry about 2016 stolen election. No. No, the election wasn't stolen; it was lost. What election was stolen? The 1996 presidential election in Russia, where we went in and bought it on behalf of Boris Yeltsin, our little stooge. We talk about democracy in Russia. I'd invite Americans to go find out what happened on October 3rd, October 4th, 1993. There it is, the famous Time magazine cover. Joe's holding it up. We bought that election. We bought it and we bragged about it. Like, no big deal. Went in, bought an election in Russia. Hey, doesn't everybody? But Yeltsin also, used tanks to fire on the parliament, the Russian parliament, bringing that down, killing parliamentarians. That's like the American president bringing in tanks to fire on Congress. All right, that ain't a democracy. That's a dictatorship, and that's what Russia was. It was a dictatorship of a weak, enfeebled, drunken alcoholic beholden to the United States, and we exploited this. We destroyed the Russian economy. We destroyed Russian democracy. We did our best to destroy Russia. And then when a man emerged named Vladimir Putin and said, "Hey, I'm going to reverse this trend. I'm going to bring Russia back to being, the power that it should be, not a superpower, not the world's most preeminent power, a power though." Russia, he believed, was a nation that deserved its rightful place on the world stage. And boy, did we resent this. We resented not being able to call the shots in Russia. We resented not being able to exploit Russia's natural resources. We resented not being able to control what Russia did, think, said. And that's where we are today. Americans are uniformly ignorant about Russia. This is just a statement of fact. I will guarantee you the following. I could line up every Russian area studies graduate in the United States who's graduated in the last 15 years and give them a test that that I passed in the 1980s. I guarantee you 80% of them would fail it because they're not being taught the right things about Russia. They're not being taught about Russian culture, about Russian history. They're being taught about how to exploit Russia, not how to understand Russia. And then I would also say that the vast majority of Americans would fail any test I gave them. I mean, I don't think they'd get more than 5% right. I'm talking about geography questions. Where is Russia on a map? And then we can just get into questions about, the ethnic makeup of Russia. We can talk about the history of Russia, et cetera. Americans don't know Russia. And you know what the problem of not knowing something, the ignorance? When you're ignorant of something, you fear it. You fear the unknown. And so here we are not knowing about Russia. Therefore, we believe anything we're told at face value about how evil Russia is, how bad Russia is. Here's a nation of 130 million plus people, and all we can do is talk about Vladimir Putin as if that's the only thing that matters in Russia. The fault is solely with America. I'm a firm believer that if Americans took the time to reach out and try to understand Russia, that we would solve more than 50% of the problems right up front because we wouldn't be afraid of them. The fact is, we'd be sort of sympathetic to them. We'd be like, hey, our government sucks too. How can we work together to, make life better? But instead, we treat them like subhumans. I mean, think about it. Do we talk about Russians as if they're fellow human beings? Do we actually think that a Russian father could love his sons and daughters? Do we think a Russian wife could love her husband? Do we think the Russians are capable of the same emotions and feelings, wants and desires as we do? Or have we classified them now as some sort of cardboard man, cardboard woman, like we did back in the old Soviet days, Homo Sovieticus? They aren't real humans, they're Soviet citizens. Well, they're not real humans right now, they're Russian citizens.
So, with an unprecedented number of people graduating from college, the people are still ignorant about what's going on in the rest of the world. Why? Why is that? An educated college person should be able to think for themselves, and that's not happening. What do you think, Scott?
Look, I'm going to get a lot of trouble for this. I think college, the 4-year degree has become virtually worthless. I think we print them, we give them out. We don't have the same standards that we used to have. Kids get credit for attendance. You used to be able to fail a course, even if you attended every course. Even when I was in college, there were a couple courses where the professor came up to me and said, hey, we like you a lot. You're a nice guy. We think you're trying really hard, but if you stay in my course, you're going to fail because you're just not getting it. So why don't you do us both a favor and withdraw before the grade counts? That way you can refocus, reorient. Today that doesn't happen. Kids go to the class. They're intellectually lazy. Their professors are intellectually lazy. The universities don't give a damn. They're not teaching. They're just simply punching these kids out into the world with a 4-year degree that is useless because they're not taught to think. I will tell you that if a person graduates from college today and they fear Russia, then they didn't get an education. But you say they're ignorant about the world they live in. They're ignorant about their own country. Okay, how many people with a 4-year degree can pass the test about the Constitution of the United States of America? Not very many. Okay, we haven't even got into geography. We don't even get into the history of this country. What do we teach in college? I don't know. That's just me getting in trouble because I've lost all faith in God. Now, I will say this. If you attend university and you apply yourself and you're graced with professors who give a damn, who will take the time and effort to educate you, you can get a lot out of a college education. That still is possible. I'm just saying that they've made it very easy for kids to take the easy route out, and they still give them a 4-year degree.
Is that the same in Europe, Joe?
Well, one of the things you'll see in Europe is that people speak many languages. Not too many people in the United States speak anything other than English, unless they are Latino or come from a different country and come over here. Because it's not important to learn other languages, because we have this idea of America great and America's number one, and that's all that really counts. Now, I think people are educated better in other countries, but there's another piece to it too, is that, I went, for instance, through the anti-Vietnam War movement and the civil rights movement. And I am, although my degrees are in mathematics and electrical engineering, I am a student of history to some extent. But, I never learned about these important periods of our history. There might be a paragraph in some book about them. It's still taught in a way in which I think is absolutely wrong, rather than the force of the masses of people and what they did to form trade unions and to organize a civil rights movement and so forth. It's taught with one good guy, usually a white guy, who makes some great decision, and we've changed all of history. And now we see in the South, we see them talking about what do they call it now? Not teaching about Black history and not teaching about slavery. Critical race theory. We can't talk about that because it will make white people feel bad. But in Germany, they have laws that says you can't put up a statue of Adolf Hitler or any of the Nazis. You could put them in a museum because they want people to know about them. They teach about that particular period and what was wrong about it, not to make the Germans feel bad, but to make sure it never happens again. We don't do that. We have roads named after the Southern leaders and statues of the people that fought to keep slavery. And we're fighting. We find some of these states where they won't teach people about what happened during that period. So we're doomed to repeat it. And we see the racism in our country, and and what happens. And how do you change that? Part of it is changing the kind of education and the kinds of ideas that people have when they're raised in the United States. But we don't do that. So we have killings, we have shootings by police of Blacks, we have racism that's rampant, we don't learn other languages, and we're very, very insular. And it leads to the kinds of international situations that we're seeing in Ukraine right now.
And an important thing, Joe, is that, you know, after the Second World War, and people learned about all of the atrocities with the death camps. Nobody's even bringing up the fact that Jewish people are still suffering. It's like they don't even exist. Would you agree?
Well, I agree. There still is some anti-Semitism in the United States, and certainly in Ukraine and in other places that I've been to, and other places that I've seen. There is some anti-Semitism, but the real crime is that we have now countries that fought against the Nazis that are supporting Nazis, arming them, training them, uh, downplaying the threat of them in Ukraine and in other countries, but in Ukraine mostly, where the movement has been more advanced than it was in other places. And I think that's a real crime.
Scott and I have talked about this a few times. Why isn't the Jewish community in this country speaking up about that?
Well, in my opinion, the Jewish community used to be a very progressive community. I'm half Jewish. My mother is Jewish. She was not a Zionist. She did not support Israel. But the vast majority of the Jewish community now in this new generation does support Israel. And there's a lot of racism against the Palestinian communities that go on there. And to support Israel, you see some of the most reactionary forces going to these APEC meetings and talk about how they're going to defend Israel and how they're going to, move the embassy to Jerusalem and how they are going to allow Israel to take over territory and settlements. And so their politics have shifted. And it's difficult now. They're on the side of the United States. They're on the side of the British government. They're on the side of NATO. They're on the side of the Zionist state. And so it's difficult for them to take a position, even when they see Nazis in the streets with swastikas, as I have seen being in Ukraine. I've watched one of these marches, these torchlight marches with people carrying flags of swastikas, so they have a difficult time now because their politics has changed. When there was a lot of more anti-Semitism, they identified more with other people that were exposed to racism and so forth. And they were some of the best fighters during the anti-Vietnam War movement. If you look at the leaders of that, you'll find many, many Jewish names. You don't find that so much in the anti-war movement anymore because the new generation of Jewish population has a different political outlook. There's still plenty of people that are progressive and understanding, like Jewish Voice for Peace and many others. But I think there has been a shift in political outlook of the Jewish population, at least in the United States.
Scott, what's your thoughts?
I mean, it is a complicated problem, but let's put it this way. The Jewish community has been very anti-Russian for a long time now. During the time of the Soviet Union, the United States in the 1970s passed some legislation that sanctioned Russia, based upon its if it wouldn't allow Jewish immigration. And so we were pressuring the Soviet Union to encourage Jewish immigration out of there. And so a lot of Jewish families who left during this time, left resenting Russia, resenting the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this is one of the stories that Israel will never want to tell. The Israelis opened up their borders. At the time it was a nation of 5 million, and they let some 600,000, former Soviet Jews in, most of whom were not Jewish, by the way. I mean, this is one of the great scandals, because Ukraine is perhaps the most corrupt nation on the planet. Rabbis would take money to falsify histories, to get people put on the list so they could immigrate to Israel. And Israel is full of a lot of former Soviet people, especially from the Ukraine, who claim Jewish heritage, who don't in fact have it. And that complicates things, because now this has become more about hating Russia than about being defending against anti-Semitism. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. It's the anti-Russian resentment that is a carryover from the Cold War that has been exaggerated by former Soviet era Jews around the world, which has blinded non-Jewish leaders to the horrific reality of what the Ukrainian government today stands for. The fact that we have people that will continue to say that Stepan Bandera was just a minor figure, don't worry about him, it's just a minority that's becoming exaggerated, etc., is sickening, especially if you were Jewish, and I'm not. But I am a student of history, and I know what Bandera's people did to the Jews in Kiev, in Ukraine. I know what they did to the Poles. 250,000 Poles were massacred by these people after World War II ended. And what they did to the Russians, they called them their subhumans. I mean, this arrogance, this white supremacist ideology that permeates throughout, especially Western Ukrainians, cannot be tolerated, but it is tolerated. If you're a Jew, you understand they hate you. They want to kill you. They want to eradicate you, and yet you're allowing your government to arm them, to further their ideologically based war against Russia, the only good thing about this is Russia's going to win, and this is all going to come to an end. I don't mean to gloat too much, but I really don't have any sympathy for anyone in Ukraine who has facilitated this sickening ideology. They will get what's due to them, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later. That's the only good news that's coming out of this.
So, so Joe, you've been in Europe for a while now. When are you coming back home to the United States?
October.
Okay,
That's
great.
the plan right now.
Okay. And what will you do with all of this stuff that you've learned um, because of your trip to Europe? What will you do with it? Speak, write a book? What do you plan on doing?
Well, I'll be doing a webinar on the 31st, Sunday, for Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace from here, on NATO and the protests against NATO. If people would like to look at that, they can go to the website bethlehemneighborsforpeace.org, and they can see that webinar. But I'll do what I always do. I'll speak. I'll try to influence as many people as I can. I'll try to make my voice as loud as possible to change people's minds and use that to build a movement that eventually can, hopefully sooner than later, can change the course of what's happening in the United States and around the world.
So, gentlemen, our time is up and we shall talk again. So, you've been listening to Scott Ritter and Joe Lombardo. This is Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. And if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube page. Gentlemen, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. And when I feel a little bit better, we'll plan something else. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Thank you for
Thank you.
listening. Bye.
Thank you, Cynthia. Take care, Scott. Hope to talk to you soon.
Safe travels, Joe.
Thanks. Bye.